The clock is ticking towards September 23rd, 2025, a date that a growing online movement claims will trigger the rapture. They point to a Jubilee year, the Feast of Trumpets, and the end of a 2,000-year cycle. But what if this countdown isn't to a divine appointment, but to a devastating disappointment? Let's decode it. Welcome to Decoding the Darkness. You've probably seen it in your feed, videos, comments, countdown clocks, a wave of urgency building around one specific date, September 23rd, 2025. But why this date? Why now? Because unlike many failed predictions of the past, this one appears to rest on a foundation of interlocking evidence, a puzzle where every piece seems to fit. Proponents point to 5 key pillars. First, the fulfillment of the ancient Feast of Trumpets. Second, a belief that 2025 is a rare prophetic Jubilee year. Third, a 2,000-year timeline supposedly calculated from the cross. Fourth, a celestial harbinger, the Revelation 12 sign that appeared in the stars back in 2017. And finally, a geopolitical trigger, a high-profile peace and security meeting at the UN scheduled for that very week. On the surface, it looks like a powerful and detailed case. But here's the thing. Detectives know the most compelling stories often hide the most devastating flaws. Let's open the case file with the 2 pillars that sound the most authoritative: the Feast and the Jubilee. First, the Feast of Trumpets. Proponents make a clever claim. When Jesus warned no one knows the day or hour, he wasn't speaking literally. They argue it was a Jewish idiom, a kind of code phrase for this specific feast, since its start depended on the sighting of a new moon. It sounds intriguing, a secret hidden in plain sight. But here's the problem: there's no credible historical evidence for this idiom theory. Genuine idioms found from that era are well documented in early rabbinic writings, and this one is nowhere to be found. Most scholars see it not as ancient tradition, but as a modern invention. Jesus' words in Matthew 24 and again in Acts 1 read as direct, unambiguous statements about divine authority. It is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority. Then there's the Jubilee. In ancient Israel, this was a very real practice, a year of release every 50 years, when debts were forgiven and land was returned to its original owners. The theory claims 2025 is one of these rare Jubilee years based on the Essene calendar. But that calendar wasn't the one used in Jerusalem's temple. It belonged to a fringe sect, and scholars still debate not only which calendar is correct, but even how the Jubilee cycle itself should be calculated. For every group declaring 2025 as a Jubilee year, another places it on a completely different date. So these supposed foundations of the prophecy, the Feast and the Jubilee, are built on interpretations that are shaky at best. Which brings us to the next question. What about the timeline itself? If the foundational pillars are shaky, then the theory needs a strong timeline to hold it together, and the one being proposed is impressively precise. Here's how the logic goes. The prophet Hosea wrote that God would revive his people after 2 days. Proponents interpret each day as 1,000 years, creating a 2,000-year countdown from the time of Christ. They pinpoint the crucifixion to AD 32. That would place the 2,000-year mark in 2032. Count back 7 years for the tribulation, and you land squarely in 2025. It sounds clean. It sounds mathematical. But the entire structure rests on one critical assumption: that the crucifixion happened in exactly AD 32. The problem? Most historians and biblical scholars working from Roman records of Pontius Pilate's rule and astronomical data for Passovers and lunar eclipses place the crucifixion in either 30 or AD 33. There is virtually no credible historical or astronomical evidence for the AD 32 date this theory demands. And if you adjust that starting number by even a single year, the entire timeline collapses. The math simply dissolves. When a perfect timeline is built on one highly contested date, it isn't prophecy, it's speculative math. and it sets the stage for the most revealing evidence of all. That revealing evidence is the piece that started this entire countdown, the Revelation 12 sign. Back in 2017, the internet exploded with videos about a rare astronomical alignment, a great sign in the heavens that was supposed to trigger the rapture on September 23rd of that year. The day came, the day went, nothing happened. But here's the thing about failed predictions. They rarely disappear. They just get reframed. Suddenly, the 2017 sign wasn't a failure, it was a harbinger, a 7-year warning. This is the classic tactic of moving the goalposts, and it's part of a long, documented history of prophetic failure. And this pattern isn't new. In the 1840s, a movement known as the Millerites used complex charts and calculations to pinpoint Christ's return on October 22, 1844. Tens of thousands sold their farms, abandoned their businesses, and gathered in white robes on hillsides and in churches, waiting. Eyewitnesses described the tension, the hope, the absolute certainty. When the sun rose on October 23rd, the day became known as the Great Disappointment. The devastation was so profound it shattered communities and faith for a generation. More than a century later, the cycle repeated. In 1988, a former NASA engineer named Edward Whisenant published a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Over 4.5 million copies were sold, and churches across America handed them out for free. When the year ended with no event, the credibility of countless ministries collapsed overnight. Fast forward to 2011, the same pattern, amplified by modern media. Harold Camping, a radio broadcaster, spent millions on over 5,000 billboards, declaring May 21st as Judgment Day. Families gathered in their homes to wait. When the clock struck midnight, there was only silence. Camping quickly moved the date to October. When that failed too, his ministry collapsed, leaving behind followers who were not only spiritually confused, but financially broken. The pattern never changes, which brings us to the final supposed sign, the UN Peace and Security Meeting. On the surface, it sounds like a perfect fit for the biblical warning of peace and safety, but here's the reality. The UN General Assembly meets in New York every September. It's not a unique prophetic event. It's an annual item on the global political calendar. In other words, it isn't a prophetic sign. It's routine politics, rebranded as something bigger. And that's the danger. When predictable events are forced into a prophetic framework, the result isn't greater faith. It's greater confusion. And confusion always comes with a cost. Because this isn't a theoretical game. When these predictions fail, they leave behind a trail of real-world devastation. In past generations, a failed prophecy might have impacted a few dozen lives in a small community. Today, with social media's reach, a single viral prediction can mislead millions in a matter of weeks. The scale of deception has multiplied, and so have the consequences. History is filled with the stories. Followers who drained their life savings on billboards, convinced they were saving souls, only to be left bankrupt and humiliated. Families torn apart over nothing more than a date on a calendar. And perhaps the most devastating casualty, faith itself. For some, trust in God collapses, replaced by disillusionment and bitterness that can last a lifetime. This is why the Bible's warnings are so direct, not just about the illusion of peace and safety, but about the deception that so often comes with it. When a prophecy creates anxiety instead of hope, obsession instead of readiness, it isn't serving the kingdom of God. It's serving the kingdom of chaos. So if the Bible explicitly warns against setting dates, and history proves the devastating consequences, then what is the true purpose of prophecy? The true purpose of prophecy has never been about circling a date on a calendar. It's about revealing the character of God. The fulfilled prophecies of the past are not a formula for predicting the future. They are a track record, evidence, proof that history is not random and that God keeps his promises. They exist to build our faith in his sovereignty, not our confidence in speculation. And the Bible's call has always been the same, not to be date watchers, but to be watchful, to live in readiness, not in panic. Because Jesus is coming back. Prophecy was never meant to chain us to countdowns. It was meant to anchor us in the confidence that God is sovereign and that Jesus will return. Not when YouTube says so, when heaven says so. The countdown has begun. The issue isn't when will it happen, but will you be ready when it does?